Fast Start, Test Complete, Module 11, Name Mapping. So far, when we've been creating our test cases, we've been referring to those objects we need to interact with their full object names. So for example, when we click on a particular button, we're referring to that button with its full name. So we've got, if we copy this and we look in Notepad, we'll see that full name as Sys Process Calc Plus Calculator Plus Windows Button 4. So every test step that interacts with an object will have the full name of the object specified in order to identify it. There are three problems with this. The first is that we're going to have many test cases. This might be test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, with many test steps, and many of those test steps might refer to the same object. So we have a test step here referring to button 4 on our calculator, another test step referring to button 4, another test step referring to button 4. Now if the name of that object changes, you get a new release of the application and the developers have changed the hierarchy or they've changed the actual properties and name of that object, you have to go through all of your test steps, update them to point at the new object. So say this changed to a button with the word 4 instead of 4, you'd have to go through every test step, update the name, and only once you've updated the name in all the test steps would the test case run again. Might get away with that with 3 test steps referring to that, but hundreds or 1,000 and you've got a big job on your hands. So that's the first problem. The second problem is to do with object identification. So in this instance I've created another tested app, Notepad, and we can see that Notepad instance here. There's nothing in it at the moment, and that Notepad object you can see in TestComplete object browser. And at the moment that object, if I wanted to refer to the window or the child object, the edit window, the full name for that can be found here, full name, and that name consists of Sys Process Notepad Window Notepad, and the property for that is untitled-notepad and then the edit object. But it's this that's important because we've hard-coded this in our tests. It's always going to be referring to Notepad untitled Notepad. But what happens when we save that Notepad? So if we do File, Save As, and I save it with a name, temp.txt, notice that that name of the Notepad has now changed. And if we refresh our object browser, you'll see that the name within TestComplete will also change. So it's no longer seen as untitled-notepad, it's temp.txt.notepad. So again, the object name has changed and we'd have to go back and update all of our test steps because that object name has changed. The third issue we've got with the approach we've taken is the actual names themselves. This is a real long string to try and remember, to type in, to edit, to modify, to look at and update. It's almost unusable for us as end users. TestComplete's fine with it, but it's not good for us. So we've got 3 issues. 1, our layer of abstraction, all of these test steps referring by name to the object. We've got names that might change from the objects, which would break our test cases, and we have these unmanageable names. So we have 3 issues we need to resolve. One is this concept of abstraction, where all of our test steps are referring to one object, and if the object changes we need to update all of them. Second is identification. If the object changes and they may well change from one run to the next. We want to be able to identify using different properties so that it's consistently identifying the object. And the third is we want to get away from these really long naming conventions. So the first one, this level of abstraction. So TestComplete, when we've been writing our test cases so far, we've been referring to directly to the objects. So we've been putting in the full name here, and it refers directly to the object names, what we call the full name of the object. And that's guaranteed to identify it, but if it changes, then we have to update all of our test cases. So TestComplete gives us this concept of the name map. And what that does is it puts the name map between our tests and test steps and the object. So our test, we create a name map object. The name map points to the object, and the test steps then point to the entry in the name map. In that way, if this object changes, all we have to do is update one entry in the name map instead of updating all of our test steps. So what does this name map look like? Well, in TestComplete we can see the name map node here, and if we double click on the name map, it opens up the name map workspace. So this name map workspace is the same as this diagram entry here that we've got in blue called a name map, and it sits between our test steps and our objects that we're interacting with. So how do we get TestComplete to put entries in the name map? Well, by default you'll find under Tools Options that this option is checked, Map Object Names Automatically, and this is what TestComplete sets as default, and whenever you do a recording it will automatically put the entries in the name map for you. Now, personally I prefer to operate with this switched off so that I can map my objects manually. And one way to do this is to look in the object browser, and you'll find if you context sensitive entry, you right click on an object, you can do map object. So if I quickly create a new project in here, a blank project, and we'll call this test project 1. I've got a name map, it's a blank name map at the moment, and under the object browser I can look at my Calc Plus object and I could do map object, and I map the object as Calc Plus, and you should see in here that we now have a Calc Plus object in our name map. I can then map other objects in here, so I could map the window. So if I highlight this, this is the main Calc Plus window. I can map that object, and I map that, and that's now entered in here as well. So I've got Calc Plus, WinSciCalc. And finally, one option I can use is to right click on there, and I could do map child objects. So rather than map the top level object, it will map all of the child objects. So this is a quicker way of doing this, and you can select all of these. I might select map objects automatically, and all of those objects will now be mapped into my name map. Like out, and we have all of our objects mapped there. Now when we use or write our tests, rather than refer to the objects with their full name, so previously we were using this full name which points directly to the objects, rather than use that name we're going to use the mapped name, so alias Calc Plus WinSciCalc static, and that is referring to these objects in the name map rather than direct to the test objects themselves. So if we go to a test step, for example, and do a test on-screen action, you'll see in here that we can select from here a particular object, and it's referring now to the name map. So we understand the reasons why we need name mapping. One, because we need a level of abstraction between our test steps and the objects we're interacting with. We've seen how to create entries in our name map, and you can do that either by having Tools Options Map Object Names Automatically set, or you can map your objects manually, either by right clicking in here and selecting one of these two options, or another option is to click on the map objects from screen button, and that gives you the chance to identify and map objects. And those objects that we map then, they all appear in our name map workspace, and that then gives us 3 panels. And what we need to do now is understand what each of these panels does for us. And they're split into the mapped objects panel, the aliases panel, and our properties panel. So the first one I like to think of as TestComplete's view of the mapped objects. So this is TestComplete's list of objects you want to interact with. And I tend to leave this alone, just let TestComplete deal with this. It'll add entries in there, remove them. But essentially that's TestComplete's view of the system. This panel down here is my view of the system, and I can modify this, update the names, change this mapping, and this is where I configure what I want my name map to look like. And the third panel we'll look at in a minute is the list of properties that we're using to identify these objects. So we said earlier about how the name of our object might change, or it might change before the test runs or during the test run. Well, if it's a name that's going to change and it's not reliable for us to identify with that, then we want to find other more stable properties to identify it with. So we might pick up, instead of a name, we might pick up a class, an ID, or some other property that's more reliable to identify by. And we'll see in a minute how we can pick those properties here. First though, a little bit more about these views here. And we can think of this in terms of 3 views of our system that TestComplete has. And we have our object browser, we have our name map, and we have our aliases. So the object browser is where we have our full name. So if we go back to TestComplete, in the object browser we pick an object, and that object has this full name, sys.processCalc+. So this is the actual dynamic, the actual static name that you can always refer to the object by, but it might change. The name might change here, an ID might change. It's not a reliable way to refer to all of your objects, but it is the view and the actual hard and fast name of the object on the system, and object browser will display that for us. So like I say, it's dynamic, so it might change, but it's the real name of the system object that we might be wanting to interact with. The second level up then is what we call this name mapping, and it's a mapped name, and this is our mapped objects panel here, and we can go down and we can pick on that button, for example, and this view of the object has a naming convention that starts with namemapping.sys.calc+ Windows SciCalc+ .button. And this I like to think of as TestComplete's view of the system. It's a cut down view because we're now in the name map, so it's, you know, we're hiding all of these objects that we're not interacting with as part of our scripts, and we're just showing that object in our name mapping panel from TestComplete. And the third one then is this aliases view, and this is what I like to think of as our view, and this is our own configured naming convention, and it'll start with aliases dot. So you can see here, if I pick this object, it starts with aliases calc+ win SciCalc+ button, and we can modify this and we can update this to make it more pertinent to us, so we can call that a different name, and it's our view and our naming convention for the system. So we've got the system's naming convention from the object browser, the full name, TestComplete's view, which is the name mapping dot object name view, and then our view, which is the aliases view. So we've seen why we need name mapping, for this level of abstraction that enable us to make our test cases more manageable, and also because it makes it easier to identify the objects, and because it makes the naming conventions that we use easier for us to understand. We've seen how to map objects in TestComplete, and the key way to do this again is under the object browser, right click and do map objects. And we've seen the different types of naming conventions or different types of mapping within TestComplete as well. So we have the object browser naming convention, which starts with sys dot something. We have the name mapping version, which starts with name mapping dot, and then we have the aliases version, which starts with alias dot something. And all three of those naming conventions are valid. So if we go back to TestComplete and we look at this button 2 here, or maybe the % button, and a right click, highlight on screen, and we can see the full name here, and I can copy that. Let's just paste that into Notepad. So that's the full name, and don't forget this is pointing directly, if we use this, it's pointing directly from our test steps to the object. So if the object changes, change all of our test steps. We have the second level up, which is our name mapping naming convention. Starts with name mapping dot, and if we look at the name map in TestComplete, you'll see this in this mapped objects panel here. So if we look down here for, I think it was just BTN, this object here, if I highlight this on screen, yep, we've got the same object, and you can see here TestComplete's view of it and TestComplete's name, if we put this into Notepad as well, is name mapping sys calc plus Windows SciCalc plus BTN. So you know, TestComplete sees the same object, but it's not a very meaningful naming convention for us. So what we did then was take the next level up, which is the aliases level, which is this panel here in TestComplete, and we actually renamed that button. We called it BTN %. Same object, but a different name. And if we put that against the other two, you'll see we have 3 different ways of referring to the same object: system, name mapping, and aliases. Now by far the easiest one is the third one, because the naming convention's more logical, it's the shortest name of the lot, and it implements this level of abstraction using the name map. So the last bit I want to get across is how we consistently identify those objects, because the third panel in the name map is the list of properties we use to identify the object. So as we've seen before, if we use this naming convention, all of the properties to identify the object are hard-coded. So process name calc plus, the window SciCalc has got to have the name calc plus in the title of the window. So if that name was to change in a later release, this version of the naming convention would stop identifying this window. And third is that the button object has a % sign on it. So again, it's hard coded to that. So for us, what we want to be able to do is uniquely identify our objects using our own properties. So instead of having them hard coded in here, we want to specify our desired properties for identifying the object in this panel. So the last part then of the name mapping concept is using these properties that we define here as identification properties for finding the object. So TestComplete has had a good attempt to pick the right properties, and if we right click on here and go show in object browser, it'll show us this % button, and we right click on that and highlight on screen, and we've got all of these properties down here, 20 or 30 different properties, all of which we could use to uniquely identify this object. Now the object properties that we choose are defined in this panel on the right here, and if you click on edit after you've selected the object TestComplete allows you to pick those properties. So it might be for me that the three most important properties to identify that object are the class, which is button, the Windows caption, which is the %sign, and maybe an index value, and we can add that to our list to identify that object. The key here is picking properties that are going to remain the same across different test runs and that uniquely identify the object. So I should be able to highlight on screen and it still identifies that object. Now if I was to edit this just as an example and change the properties here so that I removed two of them, I only have one property to identify that button now, and TestComplete is telling me, well, actually there's about 20 or 30 other objects in there that could be identified by just having the property WND class equals button. So it's saying this may cause recognition problems during the test run. So the properties I've picked are not unique enough, and indeed if I go with those and do highlight on screen, we've no idea which button we're going to get. We actually get the MC button, which is not our % button. So we need to pick the properties, and if we go Windows MC and then edit this and change that to, we need to pick the properties that are going to uniquely identify that button amongst all the other buttons on the Calc application. And again, now if we right click, it should pick the right object for us. So we've seen why we need name mapping, that level of abstraction. We've seen how to map the objects using right click, map object, and we've seen the different ways in which we can refer to those objects using the mapped objects, where we use namemapping.com, or our aliases view, which is our view, aliases.calc+, and we've seen the properties that we can select to identify those objects uniquely. But ultimately this gives us three different naming conventions: sys. namemapping. and aliases. And all three of those naming conventions can be used in our test case.